some platforms have been engineered to optimize clicking and scrolling independent of content.
Dr. Anna Lembke is a psychiatrist and professor at Stanford and one of the leading voices helping us understand addiction in the modern world.
Many people with very severe addictions can get into recovery at every stage of life and sustain that recovery for years to decades.
As medical director of addiction medicine and author of the best-selling Dopamine Nation, she explores how our brains seek pleasure, why it's so easy to overdo it, and what it takes to find balance.
The way that we tell our stories is really essential. We can tell healing stories, or we can tell stories that keep us stuck in our suffering.
In our conversation, she shares fresh insights on managing desire, discomfort, and the search for real joy. Welcome to Stanford Department of Medicine's Inside Look at the Future of Medicine. Anna, welcome to the Future of Medicine.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's been amazing to see the ripples that have happened after you gave the medical grand rounds just in a week or two ago, and to hear people talk about the topics that you discussed. And so it's really great to spend a few minutes just talking about it.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I've had a number of people reach out to me who are at the grand rounds. I've been able to meet with them, graduate students, medical students who are excited about the ideas and want to contribute to helping people recover from addiction and the full range of compulsive overconsumption. So that's been nice.
Dopamine Nation was such an amazing book, and really landmark, but also very enjoyable and informative. It just I love reading popular science books, even better when they come from my colleagues here at Stanford, and that one has had such an impact. It is a very personal book as well.
It is, yes.
More so than many of the books that our colleagues write.
Yes, it is.
And I wondered, what led you to be kind of so open about your own life, even from the beginning of the book?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that's a really wonderful question. The book is an interweaving of science with patient stories. And I had to get permission from my patients to include their stories, and they were so generous in their willingness to talk about these very personal subjects. But I got to a point in kind of crafting the book where I realized that it, on some level, would be disingenuous if I didn't also include my own experiences with addiction and compulsive overconsumption. So I sort of took a leap of faith that people would be okay, with me admitting to, having these areas in which I lack self-control. It's been wonderful to see how people have resonated with that and really appreciated sharing on that level. I also think when you look at books written by doctors, there are so many wonderful books, including many of our colleagues. But I have to say, many of them, like the physicians, just seem so sort of saintly, So I thought, but maybe it's time for us to kind of admit, we've got problems too.
Yeah, we're real people too.
Yes, that's right.
And I think as a reader, it really, it draws us in immediately and allows us to identify with you, not just as the doctor and the world expert in this area that we're interested in learning about, but as a human being. And we all have these flaws and challenges. And so it was really, I think, a moving part. And you mentioned this really wonderful interweaving of science and patient stories. That's hard to do, and in particular the stories that you tell, as you say, are very personal, and the sorts of challenges. There's lots of medical books that talk about challenges, maybe that for things we talk about more often in the public domain, cancer and heart disease. But your patients are telling you stories that they probably have not told anyone else, and yet they've given you permission to share broadly so others can learn. That's just an amazing thing.
It is amazing, and it's interesting because they wanted to share their stories in many instances as a way to help other people. And I found that incredibly moving. And of course, what's very gratifying is that the book has been read by a lot of people and has actually helped a lot of people. I know that because I get scores of emails every day from readers all over the world. Readers who otherwise wouldn't have had access to some of the basic science about addiction, but also just having this like de-shaming experience of realizing, wow, I'm not the only one struggling with this particular type of problem. So my patients' generosity has really transformed, some people's lives, which is great.
Yeah. You talk a bit in the book about radical honesty, and I wondered if that was also somewhat connected to the personal nature of the book, and that you were feeling that such an important part of the recovery process, that it might also be an important part of your book writing process.
Yes, very true. And thanks for jumping to radical honesty. It comes in the latter half of the book, and I don't often get asked about it. But it's the idea that by committing to telling the truth about things large and small, we can, improve our lives and the lives of other people. It's actually hard to do that because the average adult tells about 1 to 2 lies per day.
I was trying to decide if that was me when you were writing that in the book.
Yeah. And it's usually little things that we kind of discount, like false flattery, or just small ways that we cover up, some selfishness that we think is insignificant, like why we were late for a meeting or why we can't go to a particular event. But one pattern I kept seeing again and again in my patients who were able to get into sustained recovery from very severe addictions was this kind of commitment to radical honesty, or what Alcoholics Anonymous calls rigorous honesty. And I just found that absolutely fascinating. And so I do explore that in the book. But yes, you're right, this kind of telling my story and patients being willing to tell their stories is, in a way, in homage to this idea that by opening up and, being transparent, we're really better off, and other people come closer, right? We foster intimacy. The danger is this sort of disclosure porn, that we just sort of try to use intimate stories to manipulate other people, or on social media to get followers or posts. So there's a potential dark side here, but I think when we genuinely allow ourselves to be vulnerable with other people, the rewards are great, and yet we're so terrified to do it.
Yeah. You mentioned Alcoholics Anonymous there. It does recur in the book a little bit, and I was really interested in coming to the book sort of in a way where you would come down, or what the nuance was of your view coming from a scientist's perspective and a doctor's perspective of their program. But in a way, maybe I was a little surprised how positive you were about many elements of it.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised that you're surprised because we are living in an era of AA and 12-step bashing, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. But 12 Steps, Alcoholics Anonymous, and all of the offshoot groups, have been around for almost 100 years now. And it's evidence-based. So there's a wonderful article by my dear friend and colleague, Keith Humphreys, along with John Kelly from Harvard, where they basically compared active participation in 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous to professionally mediated treatment, and found that they're really comparable. And in fact, that if the longer you follow patients out, the better AA looks. Yeah.
Interesting.
And there's even evidence that for the most severely addicted, AA may work the best.
Wow. Okay.
So, of course it's not for everybody, and of course you have to actively participate and engage in the program for it to work. But we do know for those who actively participate, it can be incredibly effective, even when they're mandated to participate, which is also interesting. So yes, it's evidence-based. You can recommend it with confidence based on the evidence. But just like all of our medical treatments, they're going to work for some people and not others. There are many paths to the top of the mountain. So it's good that people have access to many different types of treatment.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that it lives sort of in the same world. This mild skepticism lives in the same world as a knowledge that there are people who are years out who are counting the days and can tell you how many days it's been. That's also in the public domain. And those two things almost don't quite add up, right?
What do you mean?
Well, I think that whether it's characters on television or people in the real world, there's this sense that people who've been through a 12-step program sort of know to the day how many days they've been sober, and they can recount. So there's a sense that that's a commonly recurrent feature. There are people out there who've been very successful, but at the same time that coexists with the sense that maybe there's a mild skepticism of the scientific basis of it, which I think you explode in the book, and I think you show that that's not true, and that there is real scientific underpinnings.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest point of resistance around 12 steps is actually not whether or not there's an evidence base for it. It's the whole higher power and God thing.
Right.
And we're just living in a time when people are so polarized on issues related to secular versus spiritual.
Right.
It's become so politicized, unfortunately. And even that politicization has infiltrated 12-step groups, which is fascinating and also somewhat discouraging.
Right.
So now whereas 12-step groups used to be sort of the bastion of secular spirituality, and a place where people who were both highly religious and people who were atheists could come together and self-define their higher power. What we're seeing now, based on actually a study that's ongoing, is that now you have like some 12-step groups where you can't really go unless you're have a certain type of faith, right? Okay. Or others where you're not welcome if you do have faith. It's really interesting.
Yeah. One of the central themes of the book, one that I think resonates with everybody, but maybe is somewhat surprising to them, is this idea of pleasure and pain being sort of two sides of the same coin. Right. And I was particularly interested in maybe have you explore a little what we know about the neurobiological basis of that, because I think people understand there's a yin and yang in the world, but I'm not sure they necessarily think it's so closely connected in their brain.
Yeah, I mean, what was so fascinating to me as I was researching the book, and let me emphasize, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not the one in the lab doing these detailed experiments. That's the work of my amazing colleagues. But what fascinated me is the discovery that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain, so the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and that at some fundamental level, they work through this opponent process mechanism, kind of like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. And that became sort of a metaphor for me to think about the ways in which pleasure and pain are relative, and also the ways in which, with the relentless pursuit of pleasure, ever more potent intoxicants, not just traditional drugs, but things that are new to the world altogether, like digital media, that we ultimately, our brain adapts to whatever pleasure we get and kind of downregulates that whole hedonic system, such that now when we're not engaging in this pleasurable pursuit, we're very unhappy. And the more pleasure we get, the less happy we get. To me, that was absolutely fascinating, and also beautifully mirrors what we see clinically. And I think that's what I was really trying to do, take some of these fundamental, very basic neuroscience concepts and say, what does that look like for real people in the real world? How does that manifest as people are in their addiction when they first try to stop using, how that, like, they slam down to the side of pain, that's withdrawal, this kind of counter mechanism, and how with continued abstinence and treatment they can gradually come out of that. But it's tough because there's that euphoric recall and those triggers, and it takes a long time, and it's limited by neuroplasticity and all of those things. Yeah,
I think I love the way you sort of brought us in. You actually described at the very beginning of the book into your consult room.
Yes.
I think the description of that was beautiful. And then it meant for the rest of the book we could see ourselves sitting there with you.
Yes.
And then describing how you would work through this idea with some of the patients, that it would take them the first 2 weeks or so, and they were going to feel worse.
Yes.
Helping them get to the other side so that they could eventually feel better.
Tincture of time, TIME. Just having faith and waiting. When we first stop our drug of choice, the cravings not only are intense, but they actually initially get worse with each successive day, and it feels like, oh my goodness, I can't live like this. But the longer we can go without using, the faster we'll get to that point where the cravings start to abate. We begin to be able to take pleasure in other more modest rewards, and that whole cycle and the world kind of opens up.
Yeah. The other part I loved, and in medicine here, we are thinking maybe more often on the physical side, and you're obviously thinking more often on the mental side, but you brought up this concept of hormesis.
Yes.
And I talk about this a lot, actually, because of work we do with exercise. Actually,
Yes.
you touched briefly on exercise.
Yeah.
So I was actually, as I mentioned a moment ago, running as I was listening
Yeah.
to your book.
Yeah.
But the concept that something that causes a little bit of pain, a modicum of stress, if you like,
Yeah.
could ultimately create significant benefit, is something that I was really interested in, because we often think of exercise in that dimension.
Yes. Yes.
And we're actually involved in a variety of different studies to try and work out what the molecular basis of that might be.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
very exciting.
But also then to hear you talk about it in the context of addiction and the context of mental health,
Yes.
I thought was very interesting. Can
Yes.
you say a bit more about that?
Well, it's kind of a radical idea, because so much of mental health today is really focused on this idea that pain is dangerous,
Yeah.
that we have to make ourselves comfortable, that we can't be stressed,
Yeah.
that we have to be safe, that there are triggers, that any kind of stress may leave a kind of psychic scar that sets us up for future stress
Right,
in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so, and those ideas to some degree, can be helpful for people to conceptualize their suffering. But I think we've gotten too far away from what is our natural resilience and and nature's ability to instigate our own internal healing mechanisms. And this is essentially what hormesis is. Hormesis is a Greek word that means to set in motion.
Yeah.
And when an organism is exposed to the right-sized pain, the body senses injury and starts to upregulate our own feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine, but also endogenous opioids, endogenous cannabinoids, serotonin, norepinephrine.
Yeah.
And that's essentially the runner's high, and you're going to elucidate more with that mechanism, and that's super exciting. But this idea that that we have to constantly sort of hide from the world and sort of walk around with a big bubble, I think we really have to get away from, because our brains were really wired for pain. We evolved for friction.
Right.
And in fact, especially when it comes to reward seeking, we evolved for a world of scarcity in which we would have to do a whole lot of work to get a little bit of reward, right? But that's not the world we live in now.
Yes.
We can sit back, swipe right, swipe left,
Yeah.
and have instantaneous, reinforcers delivered digitally right to our brains, not to mention to our doorsteps.
Yeah.
So, kind of flipping that and saying it's better to get your dopamine in directly by paying for it up front and doing that hard work.
Right.
That's also more resistant to the problem of addiction. It's not completely insulated from that problem, but it is more resistant to that problem.
Yeah. I think runner's high is really interesting. I've been interested in that for a long time. I benefit from a significant runner's high, which is what drives me out of my bed in the morning.
Yes.
But I was interested years ago, and you just touched on it a moment ago. For years, I think we all used the word endorphins and believed it to be mostly an opioid effect.
Yes.
And as you know, of course, there's some data now suggesting it might be primarily a cannabinoid effect.
Interesting.
Which, and then, I mean, very hard as always to really tease the neurology of that out. But in some ways, that makes even a little more sense from just what we know about the mechanism of action.
Yeah, and it really, I think, makes sense for people intuitively when I try to explain to them what's happening in addiction, right? It's like, hey, your brain makes its own endogenous cannabis, right? Yeah. But it makes a tiny little bit after you've done a whole lot of something else to earn it, right? Yeah. Now you're in a world where you can have this exogenous source of this incredibly potent cannabis, which totally lights up your reward pathway instantaneously. Your brain is going to respond to that and say, hey, I don't need to keep making my own endogenous cannabis because I have this enormous external
source.
source.
The system.
Right, and then you get this neuroadaptation, this overcompensation. I think when people hear that, there's sort of like this aha moment, like, oh, I get it. That's why I need to abstain to kind of reset reward pathways.
And so you've referenced a couple of times, and of course the idea of modern digital media is such a big topic and so important. We have a Center for Digital Health here. Can't think about digital health without thinking about both the pros and obviously the cons. And I mean, you've described these phones, these media outlets as syringes full of dopamine. I think there isn't anybody now. There's 6 billion phones and more in the world. And so to some extent, I think that the global resonance of your work and your writing was because of that. We're all sort of experiencing that. There is a smaller number have experienced really the extreme addiction, and you describe amazing stories in the book about that. But we've pretty much all experienced the scrolling phenomenon.
Right.
How did you come to that sort of revelation? Was it obvious, or did it take some time? And then how do you build a construct around that and drawing, deriving what you've learned from these more extreme scenarios to ones that are relevant for literally every day and for our children?
Yeah. It was really through clinical observation. I mean, as clinicians, we're really on the front lines. So we're going to see these sentinel signals way before you're going to read about it in the literature.
Right.
And, my career was characterized by the early 2000s was just the very beginning of the prescription opioid and more broadly prescription drug epidemic. But then, within about a decade, people started coming in with completely out of control pornography and compulsive masturbation addictions, and they made a clear and direct line between their problem and the advent of mobile technologies and the internet.
Right.
And then there was video games, and then there was social media, and now it's sort of like everything under the sun. So because I was sort of on the front lines, seeing the people for whom digital media was problematic almost immediately, I was able to see that it was going to be an enormous problem.
Right.
I always say, like, most people who drink alcohol won't become addicted to alcohol. Most people who use digital media, which is most of us, we're not going to develop a life-threatening addiction to digital media. We're going to have our problems, but we're going to manage to correct. But there is a subset of individuals, and we must take this very seriously as a society, who will very quickly be incredibly compromised because of their inability to get off of the internet. And we that is real. That is real, and it looks exactly like addiction to drugs and alcohol. It cannot be minimized. And to answer the latter part of your question, how did I draw that from that then to sort of the everyday compulsive overconsumption? Well, I saw myself in it, right? So I talk about my own addiction to romance novels, which started innocently enough until I got my e-reader, and then all of a sudden I was a chain reader, staying up later and later, taking my e-reader to work, reading in between patients. And I didn't even see it happening as it was happening, but it basically developed into like a very mild sort of addiction. Not to compare what happened to me to the life-threatening addictions of many of my patients, but it was really on the same spectrum.
We can all, I think, then draw a line from this very extreme case, your personal story, through to our own every day. I mean, whether it's like scrolling before bed or in the morning, and suddenly 20 minutes, 30 minutes have gone by.
Yes, exactly.
And you think, was that of any benefit to my life?
Right,
the last like 30 minutes.
Right,
of
so
scrolling.
true. And getting at really the heart of what are we losing when we compulsively overconsume digital media? We're losing the most valuable commodity of our lives, which is our time. Our lived time.
Yeah. What's your sense, though, about what we should, as a society, and also as a medical community, do about that? I think we can diagnose the problem in a way, but
so I'm optimistic because probably it's just in my nature to be optimistic long term about humans' ability to solve problems. I think it's a little bit like any of the human-made problems that we encounter now. It's going to take both bottom-up and top-down intervention. We can't just leave it up to individuals or even individual families. We all need to kind of come to the table. Schools, the corporations that make and profit from digital media and digital devices, government entities. I think coming together and experimenting with what works, or at least experimenting and seeing what works, is really going to be the key. And I think we need to conceptualize the developing brain, that is the child and teenage brain, as uniquely vulnerable and set that aside. What in a liberal democracy, consenting adults, consenting and informed adults want to do is one thing, but what we expose kids' brains to and how we need to inform and warn parents about the risks. That's where there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done and can be done and should be done.
Right. And it sounds like, I think you're arguing for both some level of individual responsibility, certainly for adults, but around kids, it's schools, it's governments, it's medical community, it's really everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. Kids are uniquely vulnerable for all kinds of reasons having to do with their own developmental trajectory. And there's just no doubt that the digital medium is highly addictive and harmful for kids in other ways, right? Addiction is the medium through which we are spending more time than we ought or than we want to. But then once we're there, there's sexploitation, there's cyberbullying, there's the invidious social comparisons that lead to the body dysmorphia, the eating disorders, the just feeling less than. The isolation, the lack of movement, the sleep disturbance. I mean, the list just goes on and on.
Do you think of it as a peculiarly digital phenomenon, in the sense that you could just use your phone for reading books or doing things that you used to do? I often contrast this idea, if you see two people, let's say on a Sunday morning at a coffee shop, let's call them husband and wife, but could be any two friends, and they're both watching their phones. We have an immediate negative reaction to that.
Yes.
If they were both holding newspapers, somehow there's two people having a nice cup of coffee in the morning, and I wonder, is that real? Because the two of them could be also just reading the newspaper on their phone. So to what extent is it the things that are on the phone, which include, of course, social media and the clickbait and all the other things you mentioned, and to what extent is it truly just that a digital bomb, if you like, that can hold all those things in it is part of the challenge?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I would say is that it is the design features of the medium itself that make it addictive. And we definitely neither should nor can sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater or put the genie back in the bottle or what have you. Like, this technology is here to stay, but it's very clear that some platforms have been engineered through their algorithm and other design features to optimize for watch time and keep people clicking and scrolling independent of content. And I think that's really what we need to zero in on, are these design features that really exploit our motivation and reward system. So, it's one thing to be on your phone and be reading a book. Now, I had my problems with books, yes, but or to be reading the newspaper, and it's really something else to be getting your news through a social media platform that now has comments and likes and shares and is algorithmically optimized to keep feeding you in an endless stream stuff that you've watched before. Now we're really talking about, the medium is the massage. I mean, this is the Marshall McLuhan famous quote, the medium is the message. But at one point, I guess there was a typo when he actually wrote the medium is the massage. It's like, it's perfect. Yes, the medium is the massage. It's the brain massage, which is exactly the thing that we need to worry about.
But when commerce is involved and we're driven towards shareholder value, and I think about also the shelves of our supermarkets, and there may be the bomb is sugar bombs. But we're dealing with a similar phenomenon.
Exactly. I mean, food has been drugified, right? Made more accessible, more potent, more novel with the addition of salt, fat, sugar, flavorants. This is the same thing with social media, right? We've drugified a human connection. So really, it's those design features that we have to really kind of target and think about limiting, especially again when it comes to children.
I wanted to jump back to maybe the more severe end of the spectrum for a moment. We see within our department here at Stanford in the hospital many victims of addiction, particularly methamphetamine, who end up with essentially failing hearts or pulmonary hypertension. And it's obviously it's a tragedy on so many different levels. But I, as a physician myself, feel personally quite helpless. We can prop those individuals back up. We can, of course, call our addiction services colleagues in the hospital to come. But I feel really impotent to do anything meaningful for those patients. And I think I can only remember one in all of the time I've been practicing that I believe I might have had a meaningful effect on their underlying problem as opposed to their cardiac presentation. And I wonder, since this is the world you live in and the one you think about, can you give us some hope that there might be a way that we can sort of break through or break that cycle a bit? Because it seems like it's one of the, I think, I'm an optimistic person, but it's hard to find optimism for some of those individuals.
Yes, but many people with very severe addictions can get into recovery at every stage of life and sustain that recovery for years to decades to lifetimes. And we have a lot of reason for optimism, one of which is just the simple fact that we have now at Stanford an addiction medicine inpatient consult service, right?
Yes.
So you have your area of expertise. It's wonderful that you were able to reach this individual that you recall to target his addictive behaviors as well as help his heart.
Right.
But on the other hand, we don't really expect you to have that expertise. But when people are hospitalized for the downstream health effects of their addiction, it's a very important moment to focus on behavior change. And we used to just ignore it. We would patch them up and send them out. Now something like the consult service, they can be consulted, they can come and they can do bedside motivational interviewing, they can connect them to resources. For a patient with opioid addiction, they can start them in-house on buprenorphine, right? Or refer them to a methadone maintenance clinic. Methamphetamine is uniquely difficult because it's so available, it's so cheap, and there are no FDA-approved medications to treat it. But there are other strategies. There's contingency management strategies that work. So I think we have to, remain upbeat. I do think that even in medicine, there is kind of this pervasive notion that, there's nothing you can do, it's hopeless. And that's just not true. There are so many people walking the planet in sustained recovery from addiction that maybe we don't hear about, right? We only hear about the people who aren't doing well. And
in the hospital, we see the ones who are coming back
you're seeing the ones
because they're not doing well.
And the other thing I always say to my students and trainees is, something that you say to a patient today, you may think it had no impact, but I can tell you that a year from now, 2 years from now, they may recall that conversation. That may be the very thing that propels them into treatment. Why do I think that? Because I've had patients come back 2 and 3 and 10 years later and said, when you said X, I thought about this. So we don't necessarily get to see their movement into recovery. We're just seeing like the acute crisis here in the hospital.
There's a parallel with transplant patients, because the ones who are back in the hospital having a problem. The vast majority who are doing well are out there.
Right, and this bias exists in, where you and I are in the business of medical education, and so this bias really exists also in training medical students, residents who are just in the hospital setting. Of course, it's very wonderful training, it's vital, it's dynamic, you can make a huge impact in someone's life. But on the other hand, you can get kind of cynical, right? That people never get better, they keep coming back, all that stuff. But that's why I think it's important to get these outpatient continuity experiences where you see, people do get, it is possible.
No, that's great. I love that optimism. Another area that's changed a lot, you touched just briefly on it, I think, in the book, but we do have newer pharmacological tools. You mentioned some a moment ago. Two that are been a lot in the news are ketamine on one hand, but also GLP-1 medications that for weight management also appear to have this potent effect. Still being tested in large-scale studies, but how are they, obviously in different ways, changing your world?
Well, we always need to look for new treatments. So it's always exciting when there's something new that comes along and there's promising evidence. Most of our treatments, and I think this is true across across medicine, are only going to work for a subset of individuals, right? So in psychiatry, our medicines work for about a third of folks, or you can just say they work about a third of the time. But for that 1/3, they can be life-changing. And so, something like ketamine, which has been shown to be helpful for treatment-refractory depression and is now being explored in the treatment of addiction. Importantly, as an adjunct to psychotherapy. And the reason that's important is because, of course, all these ideas, they have legs and they run off. And now you've got a lot of folks who are sort of self-dosing, or self-dosing ketamine, to self-treat their depression, and that is not good, because the evidence is not based on the molecule itself. It's based on the molecule as kind of a jump start or an augmentation strategy to a psychotherapeutic model. I urge listeners to go look up the Montreal model because it was spearheaded by one of my former students. But it's a wonderful way to understand how ketamine can be an adjunct to an intensive course of psychotherapy for treatment refractory depression, but also, potentially other mental health disorders. So that's very exciting.
Yeah.
And then the GLP-1s, also very exciting, right? Yeah. So we know that not only do they change sort of gut hormones and responses, it looks like they also work on the dopamine reward pathway by decreasing the dopamine that is released in response to highly appetitive foods. And now they're being researched not just for food addiction, but also for alcohol addiction, opioid addiction, nicotine addiction, cocaine addiction. Right. So this is exciting. And again, I always just emphasize and encourage moderation. It's not going to be the cure-all and end-all. Like, it's not going to be solve all of our addiction problems. But for a subset of individuals, it might actually be a miraculous kind of adjunct.
Yeah, it's great to have a wider range of armory.
Yes, right, because different things are going to work for different people.
Yeah. It's obvious that a story is an important thing for you, obviously, in telling the stories in your book, telling your own stories. It's also part of how we as doctors both listen to in listening to stories and treat patients. And I wonder just, in closing, if you have any thoughts about the role of story in medicine.
I love your questions. This has been really fun. So, if you think about what a psychiatrist does, we work in stories. That's our medium, right? You collect a kind of lifetime of stories. And I have concluded, probably based on the work that I do, that the way that we tell our stories is really essential to our ability to heal. And that we can tell healing stories, or we can tell stories that keep us stuck in our suffering. Language is a tool, and our stories are really not just a way that we organize past experience, they actually become our roadmap for the future. Stories are absolutely critical, and we need to do more, I think, thinking about what makes for a healing story. And I think I talk about this in Dopamine Nation, but what I've noticed, at least in people with addiction, is that when they're telling a story where it's always somebody else's fault, I know immediately those people are not in recovery and not close. Right? Right. But when people get into recovery, the story changes, and it's fascinating. And all of a sudden it's like, well, yes, this happened to me, and that happened to me, and that was hard, and that contributed probably to my risk for addiction, but here's also what I do that's making this problematic, and here's what I could change. And that ties then to radical honesty, right? Like being honest with ourselves and others about really what we've contributed to the problem. And I think this is really key, telling these truthful autobiographical narratives, again, allow us access to more data to make better informed decisions. Yeah,
that makes sense. What about your own story? Is there another book in there? What's coming? What's coming next?
Oh gosh. I don't want to talk about it because it's sort of gestating, but I mean, the writing is something that I've really, it's sort of like my little creative side project. So much of our work is collaborative and people intensive, which I love, but it's nice to have like a little creative thing on the side. And meanwhile, I'm just sort of doing my clinical work and my teaching, really enjoying it, feeling like I'm sort of, really in my career. Kids are mostly grown, and so I have more time, and it's nice.
Well, your patients and students, thank you, and the rest of us also thank you for writing so eloquently and so wonderfully, and thank you for visiting us here at the Future of Medicine. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks so much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.